Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Vince Molinaro, and welcome to this episode of the Lead the Future podcast. Our guest today is James Pryor. He is the Global Head of Talent and Leadership at Gilead Sciences. He joined there in October of 2021, having spent 4 years at Novartis, leading their leadership development for some time based in Switzerland. He joined the pharmaceutical industry early in his career as a sales representative, on really kind of selling therapeutics to physicians and other healthcare professionals, and quickly moved into managing a training team. Since then, he's held various roles in the leadership development space with AstraZeneca, Barclays, Unilever, as I said, Novartis, and Dentsu Media. He's a visiting lecturer with Cranfield Military Academy, alongside the Aston Business School at LSE. He has a master's in leadership and development from Middlesex University and other degrees rooted in science. James is joining us today because he has a diverse set of experiences in leading leadership development in large companies. And we really want to learn from him in terms of how does he think about that role? How does he think about supporting the development of leaders at scale? So welcome, James, and thanks for making time to join us today on the Lead the Future podcast.
Well, thank you, Vince, and thank you for the intro.
So let's dive right in. Tell us a little bit about kind of your role at Gilead, and then we'll dive in. I've got a bunch of questions for you that I want to get into.
Yeah, so my role here at Gilead is I'm responsible for all of the leadership development that we're undertaking within the organization, and actually pulling together a strategy rather than just, kind of firing leadership development programs into an organization. How does it support the agenda that we're trying to drive within the business and support leaders to actually deliver on that promise and potential within the business? And I'm also responsible for identifying our talent within the organization, and how do we go about identifying the tools that we use, but also how do we support those leaders with their career journeys and opportunities. So end to end, really, from a leadership development and talent perspective.
Yeah, and as I said in the introduction, you've done that in several large organizations, then really want to get a sense of your experience. But, given the period of time we've sort of come out of, as you look out over the next, say, 2 to 3 years, what is challenging your leaders in terms of how they need to step up to drive the success of your organization?
Yeah, I think it is a great question. I don't think it's unique to Gilead at all. I think everyone in the world suffering this from an organizational perspective. I think even before the pandemic, actually, the world is changing so rapidly with technology and data that leaders are having to make decisions far faster in one respect, but also at the same time slow down to understand the complexity that they're navigating. The world isn't about just solving problems. When I started my career 25 years ago, as a leader, you'd solve a problem, you'd move on to the next problem, and then you'd solve another problem, you'd get your team involved in those things. But now, actually, often if we approach things as problems, we're actually not seeing the polarity that they're part of. And because of that data and technology, that other side of that polarity can bite us very fast. In fact, overnight, when the data comes rolling in and you see the other side, and if you're not careful, leaders just then swing from one problem as they see it to the next problem, rather than taking a step back and seeing the entirety of the context and the problem that they exist in. And I think, and therefore we actually have seen over the last most probably 15 years, this kind of need of hurry up in a system, and this big hurry up driver that a lot of leaders have, which was brilliant when we were just solving problems. But as the world has become more complex, that hurry up driver and be perfect kind of works against us sometimes. And we therefore actually see a lot of procrastination in a system where it won't make a decision until it's got all of that data. The problem is, my question is all of that data ever really truly present? Or do we need to be comfortable with making decisions and see the emergence of things and then make pivots or changes, etc.? But for leaders, that's really difficult because they've been paid in the past to solve those problems and move businesses at a rapid pace.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm what's coming to mind is the work of Heifetz, and that notion of we used to solve technical challenges and problems, and now the complexity is driven to more adaptive challenges where it's less about expertise, but exactly that, it's having a broader perspective on the inputs into that situation and how to come to the best possible decision for that moment, but also for the company, and doing it in a way that advances the strategy and whatnot. What else are you seeing are some of the things that are challenging leaders today?
I just think it's the sometimes the notion of we've moved over, we've all experienced something that humanity wasn't prepared for and has caused a lot of challenges for us. And we're now coming out the other end of that. But I think we got used to working in an environment like this, Vince, where we'd actually connect in a virtual world. And now this challenge of actually being present back in the office over virtual working. And why would I come back to the office when I was successful before? Or actually, when I come back to the office, how do I interact? What does that interaction now look like? How do I reconnect? Who makes the decisions? Who's accountable for what? When actually for 3 years, a lot of the time I was accountable to moving things forward. So we saw this dilemma that leaders had of actually quite a lot of autonomy sometimes in a world where they weren't always able to get hold of their boss straight away. And so they'd move stuff forward. But as systems now open up, can you still balance those things? And also the challenge of we have big land spaces full of offices that cost money to run, and how do we ensure that we're getting that value and using those correctly with intent and purpose is also a big challenge for many leaders right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously you and your team are on the hook for, supporting the development and growth of leaders. And as you came into the organization, how does someone in your role approach that task? And given the size of the company, it's a bit monumental, right? Given the number of...
I think I was actually just talking to someone earlier today. I think some of the problems that we're facing, we kind of look at, technologies advance, as I said in my opening gambit, the polarities that we now face, the challenge of post-COVID. But a lot of these challenges were here before. I think we've just become, because of that data and technology, far more apparent and able to see them faster. I think that the challenge that we first deal with is listening to an organization. I don't think that's just unique to my experience here. It's, how I've often looked at the opportunities and approaches in other organizations. I think you have to spend time understanding what those pinch points are. And that's not just, going out and asking questions. That's looking at data in the system of engagement surveys, 360s, other things that an organization has plenty of. But how do we then kind of lay that out in a way that we can see patterns and themes in a system that potentially are getting in the way of allowing leaders to be the best that they can be and deliver on the promise and strategy that they need to deliver on? So I think there's a real big element of listening. There's also a lot of sense making. And what I mean is that the first thing you see may not be the problem. I think systems are brilliant at showing lots of symptoms, but the root cause of those things are a little bit different. And so actually it's what's behind the data that's really important. So, I talk about that hurry up driver and, the be perfect, which is an issue in many organizations. It's not related to one. And we've all experienced it in our lives. Personally, I can relate to lots of those things. But what's really behind that is often the pressure, how I look, how I show up in a system. But ultimately, questions become, what is it doing in service of or not service of the organization? And what impact is that having? For me, leadership is very much boils down to two things: context and choices. The context we exist in and the choices that we make within that context. And do those two things match? Are the behaviors too small for the context? Do we not understand the context? Is the context far bigger than the behaviors, and vice versa? So it's a good position to start with, of understanding the context that we're operating in, what we're trying to deliver, and therefore what are the behaviors that we need from our leaders in order to deliver on the strategy, direction of travel, or need of that system.
Yeah. So how do you because that then sounds like is that next step, right? You kind of go into listen, understand context, sort of sort out that sense making, sort out the symptoms to what's really going on. And then I think from there, it sounds like you need to sort of extrapolate, okay, what's the implication of that to the key behaviors of leaders? And how do you and your team kind of get to that place? So you do have a clear set of leadership behaviors that leaders,
and I think
embrace. And
I think the first thing, sorry, Vince, is that you take all of that data, you crystallize it to those themes, and therefore extrapolate those to the behaviors that are going to deliver on the promise that you need within the organization. I then think, either has the system already got a leadership framework, or does the system need one? And there are a couple of other questions. If the system has already got a framework of leadership competencies or behaviors or commitments or capabilities, however you want to define it, you have to look at the gap between the data you've collected to that competency framework and say, well, where's the real focus going to be? Is it in decision making? Is it in inspiring? Is it in caring, or whatever's needed against the work that's going to deliver on the work? Where are those bigger capability gaps against the framework? If you haven't got one, well, then there's a perfect opportunity to start looking at how you devise those key competencies that are needed in this moment in time. I think the crux of both of those, even if you have one or you don't have one and you build one, is the fact that actually it's a living, breathing document. And I do think sometimes organizations, and I've been in lots of these, and peers, etc., and colleagues in my network, sometimes we struggle that we get really anchored that framework is going to be the next thing for 5, 10, 15, 20 years of the life of the business. But that's not real, because the business changes and morphs, and what might be right for this strategy of 3 or 5 years may need adapting. And for me, leadership is an element of change and change of approach, and is a living, breathing thing within a system that needs adapting. It's not anchored into a set of capabilities that are then consistent for 20 years. And so, but I do notice that sometimes we get, again, perhaps it's that be perfect driver in some of us, that they have to be the best capabilities and behaviors ever, and they have to serve us. They have to serve us for the length of the strategy that you're trying to deliver, but they also have to morph and change.
Yeah, that's absolutely consistent with our experience as we help the organizations we work with do exactly that, and that's what we've learned, right? It's got to be a living document, as you say. To make it a living document, it needs to be useful for the end user, which is the leader. So we can't write these competencies or behaviors or commitments in jargon that maybe those of us with organizational development or HR backgrounds spend time doing. It's really how does it become a living document so leaders can embrace it. And to your point, exactly, it's got to be tied to the strategy, and as the strategy changes, we need to revisit it. So it's a cycle of iteration that is tied to strategy and strategy execution. So that's very consistent with what we're seeing. So thanks for that. So now, assuming you get to that stage, now you've got choices to make around, well, what are the best options and how we go about developing our leaders, and what kind of frameworks or ways have you learned is that you have adopted to ensure now you're bringing the most valuable development options to leaders, and not and leaders at all levels, because you're addressing that, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and there'll be many different points of view. So, our position from my perspective, but I appreciate the audience will have a number of different viewpoints. I think for me, my journey actually, I was very much kind of 20 something, 20 years ago now, very much looking at, those competencies, what I would call a deficit model. So you assess someone, you look at the gaps, you help to develop them to a clone of a model that's within that organization. And what I noticed actually, a long time ago now, 18 years ago, was my own frustration of doing all of this work. People would go on great kind of programs, come out, but actually the behavioral change was either limited or kind of didn't happen for very long, right? Because consensus will dictate that social proof in an organization will often drag people back to the behaviors that keep them safe, right? Because that's what they were successful and how they saw their success. And there's a space of safety, right? You don't want to be seen as an outlier often in an organization, because that can be dangerous territory depending on the culture and norm of that business. But so about 17 years ago, I kind of fell out of love a lot, Vince, with kind of some leadership development. And at the time, a mentor of mine introduced me to a lot of adult development theory, and Bob Keegan and Bill Tolbert, around actually what the mindset capacity shift of a human, and how you support humans see a different place and a different way and perspective of the world. And so I started to study this a lot, and noticed actually, the consistency to what we often talked about around self-awareness, moving to teams and organizations, but it was the approach that you took. And so for the last most probably 17 years, I've started on a journey of individual change at a real deep, behavioral change element of emotional intelligence, really starts to move leadership from a way of doing to a way of being. And the other big piece of my kind of work, most probably over the last 10 years, is, again, I think a lot of organizations often get trapped that leadership is often aimed for the few. So there's a lot of first line development that goes on, that first step up to your first line, learning good coaching skills and performance management and all of the things that we need. But as you go further into big organizations, often it's aligned more to talent. And so actually, though, when you look at the density and total numbers of your organization, that only caters for a very small amount of people. And for me, leadership development is a dynamic, scalable thing. And if you want to do transformation, you have to get to big numbers. And therefore, you need to find ways to support actually getting to a tipping point where you need that behavior, to be consistent. Now, the journey that individuals go on will be quite unique if you start in an individual space, because they'll have different gaps. You're not trying to, against the lens of diversity and inclusion, create clones. What you're trying to create is the ability of leaders to show up to what they need to be in the context that they exist and the relationship they have with that context. And so my last 10, well, a bit longer now, 10, 12 years, has really been focused on scaled leadership, where we can invite many leaders into a space to allow them to start growing and developing and shifting that mindset perspective. But ultimately, most of that work is done in the flow of work. It's not done in a classroom. Vince, we've spoken for a number of years now. I do think, again, we get sometimes, as leadership practitioners, we're really pleased with what we deliver. But actually, the proof of the pudding is when they get back into the organization, so to speak, and their day-to-day with the people that they're working and serving with. So I do think that a lot of my work has been about mass development, of getting people to a tipping point, because of two things. One, it starts, if I'm changing and other people around me are changing, it's easier and safer to do those things because we're all in it together. It also creates the dynamic of trust and vulnerability in a system to be able to move and adapt to the context that it's in. But also you need the teams around you to hold you to account of the behavior change that needs to happen. So I always look through a lens of, the power of 10. So start with 10 who have 10 direct reports, and very quickly you can get to quite large numbers, but it's the way you do that. And I think actually, if nothing else, the pandemic showed us from a development perspective that actually the virtual space is quite useful to get to large scale numbers quite quickly, and then use face-to-face in smaller cohorts, regionally, country-based, to continue that work. So a lot of that for me is looking through the lens of scale and pace, because the faster you can get this done, the faster that you can keep the momentum going, and then form communities of practice and pod work and smaller group sessions to enable those leaders to continue to grow in a safe space.
Yeah. There is so much in that answer that you have provided. There's a master class in and of itself on how to think about developing leaders at scale. My mind is racing with more questions. A couple of things you referenced, though, I'd love to get your perspective on, is that connection between, leadership, development, and ultimately leadership culture, because you kind of referenced that, directly and indirectly, because, I think the other part of your message there is that, and I've certainly been thinking about it, is that, ultimately all leadership development is about change and transformation, right? At a personal level, at an organizational level. I sometimes don't think that all leaders, as they're going through it, understand that. And so what's kind of your perspective on that connection between, leadership development and culture change?
Well, I think it's, again, the debate of culture has been going on for centuries, and I think it's hot topic, in the last 10, 15 years more than ever. I think my notion of culture is, culture in an organization is the individual components and the behavior that make up that organization. And so all of us play a role in setting the direction and tone and culture of an organization. I think then the pinch point, hence my scale at pace and size, is that if you don't get to that critical mass, it's very hard for leaders not to become socialized with the culture that's around them. Right. So again, they can do a lot of individual work, but if there's not a sense of others doing that work, to be blunt about it, why would I? Right. And therefore, for me, that's that connection to culture and leadership development, is they are, symbiotic in nature, in the sense of, if you can get to scale and pace, you're going to have an effect on your culture, because as more people show up differently, then therefore the culture will change within that organization. Now, the other question is, for me, is, what is the culture that you want in your organization? Is that a fixed quotient, which I think is really hard and quite dangerous to say our culture will be, because then you're determining how, everyone's going to show up all of the time. And that's not real, because humans are messy, individualistic, etc. And that's really important, because that's part of, inclusion and diversity and all of these things coming together in a rich tapestry within an organization to form that culture. But I do think you kind of can put some signposts out of what we expect of the culture to feel and look like, which also is an indication to support leaders with their growth of what they're aiming to be more like. And it's a fine line, but I do think more and more there is a bigger and bigger connection between leadership development and culture, whereas often they were seen as separate entities. There was a culture team, and there was the leadership team, and there was a talent team, and there was an OD team. I think there's more interlink between those things than ever before, because of the nature and complexity of the work that we're facing.
So really what you're talking about, that idea of scale and pace is really, really important. And, it doesn't even, you've been in very large organizations with thousands and thousands of leaders where that's a real problem, but it's also relevant in mid-size and even smaller organizations in some instances, right? How do you get to leaders to understand what those signposts and expectations are, so they can start embracing it and whatnot? And so what have you learned about striking that balance around scale, and pace? What are some things you've discovered as you work with your team in implementing these kinds of initiatives?
I think there's a couple of key things in what you said. I think sometimes it's actually easier in bigger organizations and sometimes smaller organizations because just the nature of work and the definition of roles, potentially sometimes everyone is incredibly busy right now in the world. So it's not an emphasis of busyness, it's an element of definition of role and clarity. So I think, the smaller the organization, often people do more of a range of things, which isn't possible as your organization gets bigger. The interesting thing about size and scale of intervention is there has to be something in it for the leader. And so actually, I think it's really important that if you're in a corporate organization, you need the buy-in of the senior leadership team, that actually any development or intervention or investment that you're going to make is at the benefit of two things. One, the organization as a whole to support the strategy delivery. And two, that actually it will have an impact on the end user of your product or services or whatever your organization is doing. And if using data and insights and those maps and the behavior frameworks, etc., you can build that compelling case. It's critically important that you have that buy-in, because if they're not, whilst we'd all love more flat organizations and freeness of ability to operate, there's always hierarchy in business. There's always power because of the nature and structure of an organization. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that's just the way it is, right? And the point is, if they are not bought in and role modeling the expectation, then it's not going to take flight within a business. So it's critical that everyone's on board, including your HR and P&O functions, and there's buy-in of that direction of travel. I think the other critical thing is that there has to be, it can't be too long, and it has to be weaved into the nature of the work that the leader is doing. So the approach, the design, the architecture of that work has to support that leader to be better at what they do on a day-to-day basis. And they can't be sat still in a classroom or off-site for too long. So there's a fine point of that, because the pressure becomes too much of their emails mounting up. And we can be really purist and say, well, this is time investment to stop those things happen. But the reality of the situation is that's what happens. And so you have to meet the organization where it is. And so one design in one organization most probably wouldn't work in a design in another organization. Now, the outcome and some of the tools and the models may well be the same, may be different, but you have to be contextually aware of meeting that business where it is and building something that allows them to flow to an ultimate outcome that's agreed from everyone within the top of the organization. They're the key things for me. And also, I think the other thing, it's really important that the higher you get in any organization, it's a lonely place to be, right? It's who do you turn to? Where do you get those? So community practice and community work and building a network of support is also a big piece of any design architecture for me, because actually the more they can reach out, form that network, then it's really, really important.
And that's where it's a big focus of our work, and certainly what I've come to learn, it's the biggest missed opportunity in most organizations. And I think it's incumbent upon those of us inside organizations that have roles like yours to be thinking about that notion of how do our development initiatives also build that sense of community, build that network that leaders can rely upon each other to accelerate their collective success. I'm really curious about how are you thinking, because part of your work, you develop some of your internal programs, you partner with external vendors. Give us some insights on what you've learned about how to approach that. So, and let's start first, what's your take on where the leadership development industry is right now, and what's the criteria you use when you're looking to partner?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think for me, the world of leadership development is, it kind of ebbs and flows. And again, it's very contextually based, what's needed at the time. We do a lot of work of what we would call adult development and vertical development space, which is about that mindset capacity, growth of a leader to be able to see the world very differently, deal with complexity and polarities, as I've alluded to. And there are more and more organizations, external partners that are getting into that space. And it's critical that I personally use specialists in particular areas and then bring those partners together to mix and match on the design. I do, and it's a personal thing, and everyone's different who sits in my role, but I do tend to look at a broad range of partners in work, because I do think in big complex organizations, it's sometimes really hard to have just one partner, because the kind of the ebbs and flows of the need, as we said, it's a living, breathing document, and a living, breathing competency framework. Having those specialists and then bringing them together to work together actually creates, I think, something quite precious and unique for all parties. We all learn together, we all grow together, we look at those challenges together, we navigate the system together. It gives the ability of the internal LD team the support, and also ensure that they're growing and adapting as well. Because I have a mantra that I've always had: if you're not growing yourself and doing your own leadership development work, how can you lead a system or a team or an organization and through supporting their other leaders' growth? So I do have this mantra of true partnership in this work, and that we're all in it together, and we win together, and we sometimes fail together, but when we fail, we learn from that and we rebuild. Yeah. Also, I'm very much from an emergent perspective, because we can have the best architecture in the world of a design, but the ability to look back at the end of each of those sessions and say, well, let's till a touch here, but also not just then get subject to, well, we need to do it faster or we need to do this, but to hold our nerve. And I think actually having a partnership and a group all working together on those things is critically important. And also, I think the last thing for me is, to partner with organizations that have a real true purpose themselves, and internally live and breathe what they're selling and supporting is really important too.
Yeah, it's sort of a core value of ours. Exactly that. I've learned that as well. We can't just be preaching things. We need to be practicing what we preach, because that's the expectation, certainly, of our customers. Amazing conversation. We can go on for much longer, but I wanted to start winding down. Sure. And really 2 questions. As you look out over the next 2 or 3 years, what advice would you have to your peers? Those in organizations responsible for leadership development, and kind of advice for how they should lead themselves to lead that critical function right now. And then I'll wrap up with the one question we ask every podcast guest.
Okay. So I think one of the things is to keep pushing the boundaries of this work. Keep up with lots of the research that's going on in the world and connect those things together. Read a lot, embrace the work that you're doing, be passionate about it, and also have your own common purpose about what you want to deliver for the greater good of this work, for the organization and society, is hugely important to me. But I would say, in summary, look what's going on in the world from a development of both technology to support leadership development is critically important. Some of the latest research is also really important to keep up with that. I also think you need to be bold and brave. I think sometimes you're going to have to stand your ground and push against a tide that wants you to conform and do stuff that just looks okay and doing the right work. But sometimes you have to be brave and stand up, and I think enjoy it. Wake up every morning enjoying what you're doing, and if you're not, it's a good indicator of some questions you most probably need in your own growth to find that edge and kind of purpose that you need to carry on the work, because it's a labor of love. doing leadership development in an organization over a period of time. You have to truly believe in what you're doing.
Yeah, and it's not easy work, and I think for a lot of folks in roles like you, I think it's underestimated how challenging it is. So some great perspectives there. Thank you. And the last question is, what advice do you have to young leaders, some who are just starting their first leadership role? What have you learned through your own leadership experiences that you want to share with these young leaders?
I think that the piece of advice, if I could go back and even tell my young self this, is a lot more listening. Ask lots of good questions, but also, be prepared to make mistakes, but own them, right? Put your hands up when you do, pull on your team, listen to your teams, and take that great advice. Reach into leaders who you admire to understand what what's made them successful, but also learn to experiment and fail fast. But I think it all boils down to really listening to learn, and understand that leadership is messy, and enjoy the ride.
Cool. Well, thanks, James, for your time and your profound insight. This was a remarkable conversation. I know it's going to be of so much value to both the viewers and the listeners of this podcast, and wish you and your team continued success in your efforts to create great leaders within your organization. So thanks so much.
Thank you.